It's great to be back at the Gund Institute virtually. And thank you to Taylor and others for inviting me to have this opportunity to talk about my book. My book just came out, and it's great to have this chance to share the inspiration and motivation in writing the book. And it really also is a book that is designed to be optimistic and during these difficult times, and really inspire all of us to leverage the power that we have to continue to work toward a better future and really transformation. So let me just share my screen here. And I will begin by just kind of sharing a little bit about the nature of the book. So it's not really an academic book, a classic academic book. It's really a book for the moment and the movement for bigger transformation, and how we can all engage by connecting the global issues that we're all facing, and be inspired by that. So as I talk about the book, I'd like to begin by just kind of sharing my own trajectory and my career in climate and energy, and to give a sense of why and where these ideas have come together. So I was born and first lived in Dublin, Ireland, when my family moved to the United States when I was 8. And I moved to Boston, grew up in the Boston area, and then in undergraduate really focused on environmental science and policy. In my graduate work, focused more on the science and engineering, more technical perspectives of sustainability and environment and climate, and then did postdoctoral work at the Kennedy School, again focusing on energy technology innovation. I then had faculty positions at Clark University. I was at the University of Vermont, and that's how I became affiliated with the Gund for 2 years, 2014 to 2016, as the inaugural Blittersdorf Professor of Sustainability, Science and Policy, with a real focus on the renewable energy transformation in Vermont. And then I've been at Northeastern here for the last 4 years, back in Boston, continuing to work on these issues. And I mentioned my career as context because you can see that I've had quite a kind of technical background, and a lot of the climate and energy experts in the world have focused very much on technological innovation and have focused on the science, understanding the science of climate change. And we actually know a lot about the science, and we know a lot about different technologies, and we have the technological capacity to have a very different world. But what we haven't spent enough time on is the social innovation. We've invested heavily on technological innovation, but really not on social innovation. And by that I mean connecting with how we organize our society, how we organize our institutions and organizations, and who is being included and who is being excluded from the changes that we're making in the environment and sustainability space, and how well are we connecting climate and energy with other issues, the issues that people wake up every day worrying about, whether it be jobs, housing, education, food. And that's where I feel like there's just been a huge gap in our attention to social justice and social change and social innovation. So this book, it tries to fill that gap and motivate us to connect our focus on technological innovation with social and political innovation. So the premise is that the climate crisis is a crisis in leadership, and the interconnected crises that we're experiencing right now, including the pandemic, housing crisis, economic crisis, and the climate crisis and racial justice crisis. These are all interconnected issues, and when we have the know-how, we have the capacity to be in a much better position to be addressing these issues yet here we are in 2020 finding ourselves inadequately prepared, even though what's happening has been quite, in some sense, predicted or expected, anticipated. So when we think about the climate crisis, one of the reasons that I make the claim in the book of why we've been so ineffective at preparing is we've kind of embraced this approach of climate isolationism, talking about climate change as if it's something separate, as if it's not connected with our day-to-day other policy issues that we need to address. And because of that, it often gets kind of, you know, postponed to the back of the policy agenda, right? We also, within the climate isolationism frame, which is the way I've proposed that this ineffective approach to dealing with climate policy, is that it's been a very narrow technocratic lens, very much based on quantitative assessments of greenhouse gas emissions and the goal of decarbonization, and these very kind of technical language and quantifiable measures that are all well and good, and of course they're appropriate to be able to quantify, but at the same time you lose people and you don't connect with what the possibilities of responding to climate change really are. And so this framing is often based on leadership that is based on domination and control, and we're really missing opportunities for improving the human condition. So what I suggest is that an alternative lens is really the energy democracy framing, which is much more acknowledging that, okay, we have a climate crisis, we need to move away from fossil fuel-based society to a renewable-based society, and that transformation is an opportunity to reinvest in people and communities. It's an opportunity to redistribute power, literally and figuratively. And it can be based on social justice and human dignity, and kind of leveraging the climate crisis as a moment for urgent transformation, but it's much more than climate. And the reason we want to move toward renewable energy is not just because of decarbonization, but all kinds of other social innovations that come with it, and political. So
Jenny, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm so sorry. Right now we're seeing presenter's view, just to let you know.
You're seeing which?
The presenter's view. So we can see not just one slide, but in presenter's view. So maybe under display settings on the top.
Okay, let's see. Display settings. How's that? Better?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. One of the important pieces of this that really is the motivation for thinking about why we need to diversify power is the concentration of wealth and power that in the United States in particular over the past 4 decades has really been exacerbated. And this figure here shows the widening income and wealth gaps in the United States. And you can see the top 1%, and many of us in the audience may be quite familiar with this, but the top 1% in income has continued to increase in terms of share of national income from 10% in 1980 to now over 20%. And even the gap in wealth has grown even more than in income. And this is really problematic. And these trends are continuing unless we have major transformation. And so what this means is that this has been very intentional. This hasn't just happened by happenstance, right? What's been happening here is that a group of people, the people who are in the top 1%, many of them can be considered this category of kind of polluter elites, people who are profiting from the current system of fossil fuel-based energy system, and they want to sustain it. They are resisting any transformation toward the renewable future. So the polluter elite have been making very strategic investments to resist any transformation, and they want to sustain the current systems so that they can continue to accumulate even more wealth and power. And so there have been 3 ways that the polluter elite have really been resisting transformation. And this has been very strategic, and not everybody has been aware of this. But the first is misinformation campaign to deny climate science. The second is really undermining public trust in government. And the third is minimizing worker protections and worker rights and reducing the power of unions. So all 3 of those strategic initiatives over the past few decades have contributed to this widening income and wealth gap. And it has also been, the reason they've been so effective is they have influenced federal and policy and state policy across the country to perpetuate and sustain their concentration of wealth and power. So chapter 1 of the book is called Growing the Squad, which very explicitly highlights a contrast in different forms of leadership. There's the conventional patriarchal, predominantly white male-dominated leadership that we see currently in the White House. This is based on domination, very intentional exclusion of some people, and competition and an individualistic sense, and it is very much concentrating wealth and power. That's what the whole intent is really, and prioritizing investments to maximize corporate profits and shareholders' interests. It's been exacerbating inequities, racial and gender disparities, and it denies systemic problems to sustain the status quo. So it denies that we have a racial justice problem in the United States. It denies that we have a climate crisis. It denies even the pandemic, that it's really a crisis of the magnitude that it is, right? So systemic denial of the systemic problems is part of the way to keep things the way they are. On the other hand, you could have anti-racist feminist leadership that really is based on a collective vision of collaboration and inclusivity and participation and representation. And the goal with this kind of leadership is to distribute wealth and power, not to concentrate it, and to prioritize investments in communities and workers' rights and families, and really centering all policies on reducing inequities and disparities by centering racial justice in particular. And then leveraging transformation by linking problems, so that within the anti-racist feminist leadership, there's general acknowledgement of the interconnections of all of these issues. So, and there's then the solutions, and the approach for transformation is also recognizes opportunities to connect and link these different problems. So the book really, what most of the book is really centered on is elevating the stories and the impact of a whole group of innovative and inspiring leaders. So what I'm going to do is just spend a few minutes kind of mentioning some of the leaders that are highlighted in the book, and then we can open it up for discussion and questions. So one big piece of the really importance of having anti-racist feminist leadership on climate and energy is being able to resist the polluter elite, these powerful decision makers, shareholders, and the group of people who are really profiting from the fossil fuel system. Jackie Patterson of the NAACP is the director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program within the NAACP, and she is an inspiring leader who has, they put out a very influential fossil-fueled foolery report that went through and illustrated the manipulation tactics of the fossil fuel industry, particularly targeted at communities of color. Another example is Jasmine Banks of the Uncoke My Campus organization, which is an organization particularly highlighting and acknowledging the Koch brothers and the Koch family influence on our society, and particularly infiltrating our educational system, and how fossil fuel interests and the polluter elite and fossil fuel money has been used strategically to influence our educational institutions and kind of contribute to this kind of cultural shift to encourage people to think about climate change not as a problem and fossil fuels not as a challenge that we really need to be moving away from. Another leader is Maura Healey, the Massachusetts Attorney General, who has been very strong advocate of the people and resisting ExxonMobil in particular, and their strategy of kind of greenwashing in terms of consumers and presenting their fossil fuels as a green product, when in fact we know that fossil fuels are obviously contributing and to the climate crisis and are unable to be really considered a green product. So one of the chapters in the book is about jobs and economic justice. So it's explicitly acknowledging, we move away from climate isolationism toward a more inclusive way of thinking about climate policy. We really need to be connecting explicitly with jobs and economic justice. And so some leaders in that space obviously are Representative AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's along with and in collaboration with the Sunrise Movement, and that's Varshini Prakash, one of the founders of the Sunrise Movement, has really changed the landscape of climate policy in this country just in the past year or two with the Green New Deal, right? Which is a very explicit economic policy that is about climate change, but it's more importantly about jobs and economic justice and investing public funds to lift up and think about a more prosperous future for all. Other examples in the jobs and economic justice space are leaders who are in more nonprofit organizations really focused on the future of work and the jobs associated with renewable transformation. Erica Mackey, the leader of Grid Alternatives, which is a workforce training solar installation organization that is having a big impact in terms of training people for a renewable-based future. Esteban Kelly, who is the head of the US Federation of Worker Cooperatives, who is very explicitly connecting the climate crisis with new models of organizations, particularly thinking about worker cooperatives. And Ruina Altmos, who is here in Boston, heading up an organization called All in Energy that's very explicitly creating jobs to encourage energy efficiency in communities that have not been included in energy efficiency innovations and investments. So all of these leaders are really resisting the increased economic precarity that is so widespread and has been exacerbated in the United States, obviously with the pandemic. And then they are reclaiming the power of public investment and advocating for massive public investments to help the economic situation, and really thinking about restructuring for a more inclusive prosperity. So another chapter of the book is about health, well-being, and nutritious food for all. So this chapter is really trying to explicitly highlighting leaders that are connecting climate and energy action with health and well-being. And Gina McCarthy of the NRDC, is currently at the NRDC, was previously the head of the EPA. She has been one of the leaders who has, for quite a long time, been advocating to connect climate with health, right? And that health is what people care the most about. And when we're able to connect and elevate all of the health connections and the health impacts of climate change, that's when we can more holistically address climate change. Mildred McLean, a leader of Harambee House, Citizens for Environmental Justice. She has been an activist and has spoken up and really about the racial disparities in health and how those are related to climate change, and really elevated by saying, you know, we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? With Black communities around the country exposed and having much more negative health impacts and health outcomes from climate change, and elevating that. Then there are leaders like Mustafa Santiago Ali, who has also been in his climate activism and climate action very much elevating the health disparities, particularly racial health disparities. Gillian Heshaw is a lawyer and activist for an advocate for Black farmers, and she has been involved in connecting climate with food access and nutrition. And then we have leaders like Dorcetta Taylor, the environmental sociologist at Michigan, who has really elevated the connections with environmental organizations not being inclusive and having leadership, mostly white leadership in environmental organizations. And of course, then we have Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, who has demonstrated and kind of represents the fact that increasingly countries around the world who are run by women or have strong women leaders often have been more effective with the pandemic management, and also have more stringent climate policies and are more able to prioritize in an effective way climate action. So another next chapter then really connects moving to transportation and connecting transportation with climate and energy policy. And two of the leaders who have been collaborating with each other on connecting transportation and really thinking about transportation for all and connecting transportation justice with climate justice, and really thinking outside the box in terms of our transportation system are Ayanna Presley, one of the members of the squad, a representative from Massachusetts, and Michelle Wu, who's a Boston city councilor who just announced her candidacy for to be mayor of Boston. And they have been really emphasizing the potential and the linkages with our transportation system. Again, focusing on not just technological innovation in transportation, right? And the Tesla is not the answer for clean transportation for all, right? But a lot of climate experts and energy experts have been pushing electric vehicles, but there's so much more than electric vehicles when we think about a transformative climate politics that includes transportation. And that includes big investments in public transportation and advocating for free transportation, potentially. Obviously, Greta Thunberg is another leader who has connected through her own actions and her own advocacy, how transportation is linked to climate change. When she was, last year, when she was coming over to the United States, she very publicly, decided to move herself and through boat transportation and sailing rather than flying in fossil-fueled air transport. So she has also been a leader who's kind of very explicitly connected transportation issues with climate and energy. The other area, another crisis, housing crisis, and the issue of housing is another key area that we increasingly need to and will be connecting with climate and energy. There's this phrase that some of the Sunrise Movement and other youth around the world, that our house is on fire, talking about the earth as our home. But beyond that, housing is as a human right is increasingly being discussed, and thinking about how housing and climate and energy policy are interconnected. We have leaders like Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, another member of the squad, who has been a very strong advocate for housing for all and much better investments and improvements in public housing. And that's also been a part of some of the discussions about the Green New Deal. We also have leaders like the 4 women who were evicted in Oakland, California in January of this year, who, for squatting in a house that was empty, and given the housing crisis with so many homeless people, but then we have homes that are empty, these women went into one of the empty homes and then were evicted. And this shows the militarization of the eviction. In the middle of the night or very early one morning, Oakland sent literally tanks and armed men to come and evict these homeless women from the building that they were living in. And so a whole new movement connecting housing for all and homelessness and the precarity of housing insecurity, that with the wildfires and increasing flooding and other climate disruptions is just going to be increasingly a challenge for around the country. And so that is another example. And finally, with the housing category, another really inspiring leader is Kanahas Freedom Manuel, an Indigenous woman who they've created an Indigenous women's group called the Tiny House Warriors, who are resisting the trans-regional pipeline in Canada by building small homes that are actually tiny houses that are mobile, that they are blocking the pipeline construction. So another example of a different kind of leadership in resisting fossil fuels, connecting it to housing and their connection with the land as their home. So I'd love to open it up to discussion and questions here. I will just say, the last chapter of the book really tries to synthesize and connect and inspire us all to leverage our own collective power for a larger transformation that connects climate and energy with economics justice, with housing justice, with transportation, and with health. And when we think about what can we all do, there are so many ways that we can engage. And among those, I really encourage us all to lead and act to inspire new leaders and encourage leadership among and support new emerging leaders at all levels. Really advocating for system change. We're at a point where we know that small incremental steps are going to be insufficient to deal with all of these interconnected challenges. We also need to understand and unlearn racism and sexism and talk about racism and sexism. We're making progress in some communities and in some spaces there. But there's still widespread denial that we have a racial justice challenge or crisis in this country. So there's a lot there that we need to do. Voting and helping others to vote is essential. Obviously, that's a big effort. A lot of us are focusing on it in the next few weeks before the November election. Prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion in every space, every decision, everywhere, is key. And we need to be advocating for locally appropriate, regional, community renewable energy. We want to be continuing to leverage data, science, and information for change, while we're paying attention and actually using that data and science and information to acknowledge and perpetuate and encourage social change as well as technological change. Really supporting cooperatives and other novel economic structures is a great way to be considering some of the changes that are possible, and then also connecting across the divide. Obviously, we're increasingly divided in this country, and figuring out ways to listen and learn from each other is very important. So I end with just the inspiration of some leaders, particularly Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president in 1972, with a focus on many of these issues, not the climate crisis, but many of the other issues. And Mary Robinson, who's a former president of Ireland, who's been an international leader on bringing more inclusive climate politics and climate policy nationwide. So I will end there and just say that my book is available. All the author proceeds from the book will go to NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And again, the book is meant to be an inspiration and a way for us to celebrate some of the leaders and elevate the motivational time and space for all of us, especially given the challenging time that we're in. So thank you very much, and I will be happy to take questions and have a discussion.
Thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I wish you could see, there's more than 50 people connected, and I wish you could hear everyone applauding right now. I want to remind everyone to use the Q&A for any questions that you all might have and to start this conversation. And actually also share, ooh, I lost my Zoom. Also share the comment that Matt Voss said, this talk is exactly what I need right now. Yes. So while we get some questions, I actually wanted to start with one of my own. I was wondering, you know, you gave so many like uplifting examples and of powerful women that are making change, that are giving me so much hope. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit of like, as a graduate student, for example, like how can we connect to some of these women, or how can we connect with some of these like leaders making change and incorporate that in our research to contribute to this work of climate justice?
Yeah, so I think there are increasingly opportunities for all of us. You know, if we're doing research, it tends to be, you know, a more narrow project, right, that has specific goals in terms of generating new knowledge and advancing the base of knowledge, right? So, which is all very helpful. And the time horizon is such, obviously sometimes in graduate school, that it's, you know, a longer time horizon, and it might feel like, you know, you might want to get involved in something more urgent or connected to the current situation. And I think there are lots of opportunities to do that. I would encourage graduate students to think about the more specific, timely connections that their research contributes to, and I think there's surprisingly lots of examples of that. For example, if you're doing work in agriculture and food, you can engage in you know, some food justice initiatives that are going on right now, and you know, find connections, and there are connections, right, in all of our work in environment and sustainability. There's a social justice component to every topic, really. And so, and then I guess the other thing is to think about writing for non-academic audiences. There's increasing trainings for all of us to be able to write op-eds and you know, engage in different ways that can take some time and could be a little bit distracting from your primary research, but it could also give you additional inspiration and motivation and to help you continue, because PhD research obviously is a bit of an endurance activity. So it's good to mix it up. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so Kenna is asking, how do we address the discriminatory backlash that members of the squad and other prominent female leaders face in a way that discourages this kind of blatant sexism without validating these types of criticisms by acknowledging them in the first place?
Yes. I think we need to, you know, have a, in some sense, you know, a zero tolerance. If call people out and just dismiss, that's inappropriate, that's, you know, and without spending too much time on it, right? Because there's so much of that negativity right now in the public discourse. Every time any of us speaks up or puts an idea out there, we're all at risk of being attacked, and in some very negative and disrespectful ways. I think we as academics and as people contributing to the public discourse have a responsibility to demonstrate civil discourse and maintain certain basic expectations of respect, and calling it out when we see it, but without giving it too much additional attention.
Great, thank you. Calling it out. I'm definitely learning how to do that.
Yeah, it's not
okay. But definitely worth it. So Matt is asking, what does meaningful research on social innovation for just transitions look like? And how might institutions like the GUN support this type of research?
Okay, glad to see you here.
Yeah, so research on social change and social innovation, could take all kinds of forms, and many probably at the GUN are involved in some of that. I know. So it's not that there's none of this going on, right? There is, but we kind of, at the national level, I guess, there isn't widespread investment in and research dollars supporting, there's some niche opportunities here and there, but if you compare with Europe, where there's been huge investment in kind of transitions research, which is a huge category of study that there's multiple professorships and PhD programs and a whole emerging field on studying social change and how transformation happens. And so some of us in the United States have been engaged in connecting with some of that research, but we don't have as many opportunities for funded opportunities in that space. So it has limited what we've been doing in the United States. But all of us can, again, be creative and build off the higher funding levels in Europe, and integrate this kind of research about transformation into our own research agendas. And then thinking about co-creating research proposals with non-academic organizations is another great way to consider integrating more social change and social innovations into our work, by really studying, what are people doing on the ground, and how are different, what are some of the innovations that are happening that may be, in a kind of niche space, and so that they aren't in the mainstream, and so people don't know enough about them. So that's another role of academics, is to, we can research innovative things, and then through our research kind of elevate awareness about, and also potentially contribute to adapting the innovation.
Great. Donna Rizzo says, great talk, Jenny. Thank you. Very inspiring. I look forward to reading the book. In writing it, is there one specific example that stood out as perhaps most inspiring to you personally?
I mean, the squad as a collective, I think is my inspiration, and all 4 of the members of the squad. And Ayanna Pressley always says, anyone who's fighting for social justice is a member of the squad. So the squad is, it coalesced as a unit because of the misogynistic and racist attacks that they had to collectively respond to or receive, and then it has kind of kind of solidified as a group that we can all kind of connect with and appreciate. And so I mean, they are kind of my inspiration, and you can see so many other emerging leaders who are able to feel more legitimized because of the platform that those 4 women have elevated in the country. So I think that's really, really inspiring. And I think really, you know, we build off the accumulation, the experiences that people have, and the impact they have really motivates others and builds broader coalitions and inspires new leadership.
For sure. Along those lines, Taylor Ricketts is asking, after studying these leaders, were you able to discern any common attributes or characteristics among them? Recurring themes about their leadership, motivations, trajectories, etc. Such a wide array of inspirational people.
Yeah, so there were the people that I decided to include in the book was also the most hardest part of writing the book was deciding who to include, because there's so many more leaders, right? Like I could have kept going, and there's so many people doing really inspiring things. And I think part of the kind of the characteristic that they all share, or that many share, is really, I guess this isn't necessarily characteristic, but like, centering of the social justice priority in everything they're doing. And I think what we realize is that women and people of color and people who have not been historically in the halls of power, right? When those people come into positions of power, they bring with them their life experiences that enables them to be more creative about how to center that social justice piece into whatever the policies or the decisions that are being made. So I guess I would also just say, it's not, the anti-racist feminist leadership is not only about women and people of color in leadership roles. Everyone can embrace anti-racist feminist principles, right? And so it's both the representation that people's lived experience brings, but it's also elevating those priorities among all of us, right? Including white men. So I think that's an important piece that I would connect with Taylor's question in terms of the characteristics of the leadership.
Great. I'm seeing many questions trying to go back at the connections of research institutions and some of these movements. For example, Joanna Santoro asks, what is the role of academia in diversifying power in the fields of environment and climate? How can academic institutions move forward teaching climate justice as more of a core part of environmental programming rather than as a specialty? And together with that, Lizzie Laurie asks, well, she first off wants to thank you for this inspiring talk. It is great. It's a great talk that is fully focused on all the awesome people and work going on to diversify power and move forward energy democracy. And so a question that's coming up for her regarding the system that many of those listening to this talk find themselves is, how do you see higher education fit into diversifying power? Are there educational institutions, leaders that are doing well in transitioning to a more anti-racist feminist leadership in higher ed?
Yes, great question. So, I have been in higher ed basically my whole career. I thought I would, go be more involved in policymaking directly at some parts of my career, but I've been pretty steadily in higher ed in different universities and colleges. So I think a lot about the role of higher ed. And, on some level, higher education is part of this elite space where people have the freedom and the privilege of thinking more broadly, and access to higher ed is a big issue. Obviously, higher education has become a mechanism by which to stratify society, right? Those who have gone to college and those who haven't end up being categorized in different ways in terms of the opportunities. At the same time, higher ed is, and academic research in particular, is a place where, as I said, again, we have the freedom and the privilege of elevating some of these issues in ways that nowhere else maybe has the space or in different ways. So I think, you know, in my own university right now at Northeastern, we're thinking a lot about how can we redesign the curriculum to make sure that issues of social justice, racial justice, economic justice are centered, right? Not as a separate class on some of those things, but like integrated into the curriculum. It's hard because many of our conventional disciplines, you know, bring with them a legacy of a lot of more traditional white men, dominant disciplines that have that don't necessarily have a broader perspective here. So there's a lot of space for change in higher ed, and I think the curriculum is one place where there can be major changes to be more inclusive and broaden what we're actually teaching students. And then the other big piece is access, right? And thinking about how who is able to take advantage of who has access to higher education and who doesn't. And obviously right now with the pandemic, we're in a time of transformation and disruption within higher education. And we think, you know, it seems clear that a lot of things are going to change, and a lot of things are changing, not just this modality of being virtual, but reconsidering, you know, the costs and the finances and the levels of public support versus private support. And so there's lots of possibilities, and it's not clear exactly how everything will play out, but there's a lot of space for higher ed to have a bigger impact.
For sure, and I've been thinking about that too. I hope that this virtual new world gives a lot of hope for change so that there's more access to higher ed. And along similar lines of collaboration, someone from the Massachusetts Climate Action Network is saying, great presentation, Jenny. I wonder if you can address the opportunities for academics and grassroots advocates to work together to initiate system changes. As an ED at a nonprofit, I would love to work more closely with academics on issues of energy equity towards alleviating energy poverty. Is there an already existing in Boston where these two groups come together?
Yeah, great question. I think there are opportunities, but I don't think they're very well organized necessarily or coordinated. The ones I know about are kind of spread out in different ways. There's the Green Ribbon Commission Higher Ed Working Group, for example. So that's a group of academics working with, and higher ed working with, the city of Boston and their climate action planning, which obviously is different than nonprofit and advocate groups. And so I think there's definitely potential for more of that. With Michelle Wu in Boston proposed and was released a Green New Deal for Boston, for the city of Boston. So I think that provides an a kind of focal point for academics and activists to work together. So I think there's a lot of potential, and I think it's kind of been not very well organized or coordinated, but I do think there's more space for that, especially during in the moment we're in and the movement we're in right now. So feel free to get in touch and we can talk more about possibilities. And I'm not aware of all the possibilities. You know, they're different, and all the current relationships that are building and growing. But there's a lot of space there.
Thank you. Christine is asking, Thanks for an awesome talk. I'm curious about connecting the housing crisis and solutions to it with the climate crisis. I work with cities on urban and community forestry plans, and I'm currently talking with the city of Oakland about community engagement in their urban forest master plan. A key issue is concern around green gentrification or greening neighborhoods, which then become more unaffordable to live in. Do you have any insights about how to more effectively connect issues of housing policy and greening policies to avoid gentrification? I have had a hard time finding a lot of guidance on this.
Yeah, great question, and a real challenging space. I think what's happening, and I think the call is for, you know, the leadership that's really been thinking deeply about housing and the housing crisis is really massive public investments in housing are needed. There's no other way really to the homelessness and housing insecurity has just been getting worse and worse. And you know, as I mentioned, with increased storms and flooding and fires in the whole West Coast, I mean, there's more and more housing, people getting displaced from their homes. So, I mean, public investment in housing is going to be essential, and that is, again, not always connected, as you mentioned, to the climate crisis, but I think it needs to be, and there's acknowledgement of this public investment in kind of transforming what's important and what we need to prioritize. So the gentrification and climate gentrification and green gentrification, as you mentioned, is a real problem, and I think we need to be very, very careful and resist continued environmental green space measures and other things that perpetuate more housing displacement, and that's to connect the two. We really need to recognize and acknowledge the housing crisis and focus on that. And then it's one of these situations where by focusing on carbon emissions and greenhouse gases associated with housing and things like that, we have inadvertently probably contributed to housing crisis being worse, because rather than switching it around, and if we were able to focus on, you know, if we want to make housing insecurity, you know, if we want to focus on that as the problem, then those investments in public housing or more public investment in housing can then lead to more efficient housing and lower greenhouse gas emissions in housing and that kind of thing. So it's kind of the idea, some of the ideas, and many of the leaders in this space, as I understand it, are advocating to prioritize the social justice piece and think about the climate and carbon emissions as a secondary piece of that, but important part, because as you make those investments, you can be investing in much more efficient housing and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our housing stock.
Great. Jessica is asking, hi Jenny, I really enjoyed your talk and have two questions. What point of time in our career would you recommend really pushing for change? I feel as a young scientist, you might be more at risk of establishing yourself if you are non-traditional. And two, what would be the best way to push for social change and innovation without risking your career?
Yeah, so without knowing exactly, you know, your career trajectory or what spaces the person who asked the question is thinking about, I guess I would say, you know, I think I would encourage all of us to be true to what we're passionate about throughout different times in your career. And obviously you might need to prioritize certain parts of your work at different times, depending on your goals and where you are and which steps you want to get to next. But trying to do that in a way that doesn't compromise what you're really passionate about, because ultimately for a, you know, rewarding career and for a impactful career, you want to be simultaneously, you know, going through the hoops of whatever it is you need to get to where you want to be, and aligning that with what you're really passionate about. So there's no perfect balance of so, there might be times when those don't seem very well aligned, but trying to take opportunities that allow you to align those as much as possible throughout your career, I think is key. And there's also the external landscape is changing so much. So the question was framed a little bit of you could hurt your career if you be more advocate. More and more, there's opportunities and respect for academics who are involved and outside of their academic writing and research. So it could also be a bonus, right? You could be actually more well-respected and it could advance your career. So I don't think you necessarily have to think of it as an either or. And increasingly, there are opportunities for connecting more activist engaged work with research and academic teaching and learning as well.
I sure hope so, because we all need to be advocates. An anonymous question is, how do you see the role of women in this movement changing as we move forward?
Well, I mean, I think there's more and more opportunities for women. I mean, I think about my own educational background, and most of my faculty when I was in university as a student were men, and I think that's changing, and there's more opportunities across the board for the more critical mass and the more diversity there is throughout the different spaces that we're in. The more of a role there is and the more open and respected different people's perspectives are. So I think there's acknowledgement that diversity, not just gender diversity, but all kinds of diversity, racial, cultural, ethnic, age diversity leads to more innovation, better decision-making, and a broader and hopefully more effective priorities. So I think that recognition is becoming more mainstream, although in some spaces it's still not the mainstream.
Yeah, and with that great ending, I'm gonna wrap up the Q&A. Unfortunately, I didn't get to make it to all the questions. There are just so many good questions coming up. But I do encourage you to further connect with Dr. Stevens. And on behalf of the Gund Institute, I want to thank you, Jenny, and everyone who joined us online. We'll have the video and podcast of today's talk available next week. And please join us again next Friday for our next Gund Exchange with Joshua Faulkner from UVM, whose talk is Applied Research and Outreach at the Intersection of Agriculture, Climate Change, and Water Quality in Vermont. And that will be October 2nd. So thank you again, and have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Thank you. It was great to be here.